There was a man once born not in the silence of obscurity, but in the shimmer of luxury. His story would one day shake empires, not through conquest, not through gold, but through an inner revolution that rewrote the very idea of freedom. His name was Siddhartha, born into a palace surrounded by beauty, silk, and song. His every step was cushioned, every glance met with admiration, every desire fulfilled before it could fully form. But the walls of that golden world were not built for truth. They were built for protection from pain, from aging, from death, from the raw truths of life. And yet it's often in the quietest cracks where the light begins to seep in. His father, a king whose love was as deep as his fear, orchestrated a life of perfection. If the boy never saw suffering, maybe he would never question, maybe he would remain enthroned in a perfect illusion. So the gates of the palace were kept tightly shut and the servants trained to smile. No sickness was allowed near, no grief, no wrinkle or wound. The prince would grow up believing that the world was flawless, safe, eternal. But deep down beneath the layers of silk and ceremony, something stirred, something restless. At 29, when most men are settling into the roles life has assigned them, Siddhartha asked for something different. A chariot ride beyond the palace walls, a simple journey, the kind no one had ever dared to give him before. What awaited him there was not just a journey, it was a rupture. Because what he saw in those streets, for the very first time, were the truths his father had hidden from him. The first was an old man, hunched and trembling, skin sagging like worn parchment. The second, a sick person, twisted in pain, feverish and pale. Then a corpse, lifeless, cold, surrounded by the wails of the grieving. Siddhartha watched with wide, unblinking eyes. These weren't philosophical problems or abstract ideas. This was real, unavoidable. The veil had been torn. What was seen could not be unseen, but it was the fourth sight that changed everything. A wandering ascetic, a man with no possessions, no attachments, no visible comfort, and yet he radiated peace. While others clung to illusions, this man had let go. Something about him struck a chord deeper than words. Siddhartha, raised in the luxury of abundance, had never seen serenity like this. It wasn't happiness in the conventional sense. It was something richer, a kind of freedom that gold could never buy. And that, more than the shock of death or the pain of illness, was what lit the fire in him. That there might be a path out, a way to transcend the cycle of birth, aging, sickness, death. A way to meet life without being enslaved by it. That night, the palace could no longer hold him. His silk robes felt like chains. The laughter of the court sounded like echoes in a dream. He looked upon his sleeping wife and child and knew he loved them. But love, in the deepest sense, had to include truth, and the truth was calling him beyond the walls. So he slipped out. Not as a man running away, but as a man walking toward something, toward understanding, toward clarity, toward liberation. For 6 years, Siddhartha walked a path most would not survive. He lived among the forest dwellers and seekers, studied under masters who could silence their thoughts for hours, who could enter meditative states so deep they could barely feel their bodies. He learned from Alara Kalama, who taught him how to dissolve into the sphere of nothingness, a state where the self vanishes and only vastness remains. It was impressive, it was powerful, but it wasn't freedom. The pain always returned, the illusion always reassembled. Then he went to Uddaka Ramaputta, who taught a meditation so subtle, so refined, it could only be described as neither perception nor non-perception. Imagine touching the edge of existence with a mind so still it forgets it exists. Siddhartha mastered that too. And yet, even in that ungraspable state, Suffering still lingered like a shadow on the edge of light. He had scaled the heights of the meditative world but found no escape, just more layers, more clouds. Disillusioned but undeterred, he left those teachers and went even further, into the realm of severe austerity, starving his body until it was little more than skin draped over bone, holding his breath until stars swam in his vision, denying every comfort, every sensation, every softness of the flesh. He became a symbol of discipline. Other ascetics gathered around him, inspired by his resolve. But inside, Siddhartha was collapsing. The deeper he drove himself into punishment, the further away liberation seemed. Then one day, while nearly faint from hunger, he collapsed beside a river. And there, barely conscious, he remembered something. Not a teaching, not a scripture, but a moment from childhood. A memory of sitting beneath a tree, watching the wind in the grass, his body relaxed, his mind alert, open. It wasn't a state of indulgence or deprivation. It was simply being, balanced, awake. That moment returned like a whisper from the depths, and with it, a realization bloomed. The answer wasn't at the extremes. It wasn't in palace luxury, nor in forest starvation. It was somewhere in between, the middle way. With that, Siddhartha accepted food for the first time in years. His fellow ascetics, shocked, thought he had fallen. They didn't see a return to strength. They saw a return to weakness. But Siddhartha was no longer seeking approval. He was seeking truth. He bathed, he ate, and with a clear mind and steady heart, he walked to a quiet grove near a tree, the Bodhi tree, and sat. Not to dabble, not to experiment, but to end it, to face everything, to break through or die trying. For 49 days he sat in stillness, not without struggle. Mara came, the whisperer of doubt, the tempter of mind, the voice that says, "This is too hard," or "You've gone far enough," or "You're not worthy." Mara threw desire, fear, pride, illusions. But Siddhartha didn't fight back. He watched, he saw, he stayed. And on the final morning, as the star of dawn broke the horizon, something inside him broke too. Not in pain, but in freedom. The illusion of separateness shattered. The identity he had clung to, prince, seeker, ascetic, fell away like old skin. What remained was vast, still, awake. He was no longer Siddhartha. He was Buddha, the awakened one. But awakening wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, a birth into a new way of being. He didn't run to the mountaintop or hide in silence. He walked back into the world to teach, to share, to offer the path, not as dogma, but as invitation, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the Middle Way, simplicity, presence, compassion, a way out of suffering that didn't require belief, only willingness. And people listened, not just because of what he said, but because of how he was, still, clear, radiant without effort. He lived and taught for 45 years, never claiming divinity, never building monuments, just walking, speaking, resting, offering. A man who had gone beyond need, beyond fear, beyond illusion, and who saw the same potential in everyone he met. That's where we'll begin. The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet hills of Lumbini, its golden rays gently brushing the earth awake. Birds chirped as if announcing something sacred, and the air carried a stillness that felt almost divine. It was on such a morning, somewhere between the 5th and 6th century BCE, that a child was born who would forever change the course of human thought and understanding. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and although he came into the world wrapped in royal comfort, his destiny would lead him far beyond the walls of his father's opulent palace. His father, King Suddhodana, ruled the Shakya clan and had grand plans for his son's future. From the moment Siddhartha cried his first cry, the king swore that the boy would never know sorrow, never glimpse pain, never even brush against the edges of mortality. This was a prince who would know only comfort, joy, and beauty. The royal astrologers had predicted a strange duality. Either Siddhartha would become a great king, a ruler of empires, or he would abandon it all to become a spiritual teacher unlike any the world had seen. Suddhodana clung desperately to the first possibility, designing a life so gilded that suffering would never touch his son's soul. Inside the palace walls, Siddhartha lived in a wonderland. The gardens bloomed year-round. Music, laughter, and stories filled the halls. If illness arose in the kingdom, it was kept far from his sight. If anyone aged, they were ushered away. Death, that inevitable specter, was scrubbed from existence. Servants, dancers, philosophers, everybody played their part in maintaining the illusion, and for many years it worked. The young prince grew into a handsome, thoughtful man, marrying a beautiful woman named Yasodhara and becoming a father to a bright-eyed boy named Rahula. But beneath all the luxury, questions began to stir. There was a longing in Siddhartha's heart that the gardens couldn't answer, a whisper that echoed louder with each passing year. At the age of 29, with curiosity burning like a flame inside him, he convinced his charioteer to take him beyond the palace gates. It was on these trips that the walls around his mind began to crumble. On the first journey, he saw an old man, stooped, trembling, time having carved its story into his flesh. Siddhartha had never imagined such a state could exist. He turned to his charioteer, asking what could cause a body to weaken like that. "Age," came the reply, "something no one escapes." The prince was shaken. On the next trip, he encountered a man stricken with disease, his face pale and eyes wild with pain. Again, Siddhartha asked, "What has happened to him?" And again the truth came. Sickness afflicts us all. Then came the third sight, a corpse, still and silent on a funeral pyre, surrounded by mourners and smoke. Death. The final, irreversible stop on this journey called life. For a man who had never seen so much as a wilted flower, the revelation was earth-shattering. But on the fourth trip, Siddhartha witnessed something entirely different. A wandering monk, serene and composed, dressed in simple robes and carrying no belongings, walked past him. There was a calm in his step, a peace that radiated from within. Siddhartha asked, "Who is he?" The answer struck like lightning. This man had renounced the world in search of something higher, something unshakable. That was the turning point. The illusion shattered completely. The palace, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Siddhartha couldn't unsee the truths he had discovered. How could he return to his life of indulgence, knowing that age, illness, and death waited for all, regardless of wealth or power? One moonlit night, while his wife and son slept peacefully, he made the most difficult decision of his life. Leaving behind the comfort, the status, and the love of his family, Siddhartha quietly slipped away. His heart ached with the weight of his choice, but something deeper pulled him forward. The call to find an end to suffering. He cut his hair, changed his clothes, and began a journey that would span 6 long years. A journey that would take him to the edges of human endurance. He studied under great spiritual masters, learning powerful meditative techniques. The first teacher, Kalama, showed him how to reach a profound state known as the sphere of nothingness. It was deep, empty, and strangely peaceful. But it wasn't the answer. There was still restlessness within. So he moved on, training under Uddaka Ramaputta, who led him into an even more refined realm, the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. It was delicate, like a whisper at the edge of awareness. Yet again, Siddhartha found no satisfaction. These meditations brought temporary stillness, but not liberation. Disillusioned, but not defeated, Siddhartha took matters into his own hands. He joined a group of extreme ascetics and pushed his body to its absolute limits. He starved himself, lived off tiny morsels, held his breath for minutes on end, and sat unmoving under the scorching sun and biting wind. His body withered. His once regal frame was now skin and bones. But even in the grip of suffering, the ultimate truth eluded him. Then one day, as he sat on the banks of a river, barely conscious from hunger, he heard a simple tune. A musician passing by was teaching his student how to tune a string instrument. If you tighten the string too much, it will snap. If it's too loose, it won't play. It was as if the universe had spoken directly to him. The path to truth, he realized, was not found in extremes, but in balance. This insight sparked something profound. He accepted food from a village girl named Sujata, nourishing himself for the first time in months. His fellow ascetics, believing he had betrayed their path, abandoned him. But Siddhartha was no longer looking for approval. He was searching for reality. He walked to a quiet grove in Bodh Gaya and found a sturdy tree under which he could sit. With resolve deeper than the ocean, he vowed not to rise until he had pierced through illusion and discovered the truth of existence. Days turned into nights, and nights into days. Thoughts rose and fell like waves, but Siddhartha remained unmoved. As he meditated, Mara, the personification of desire and fear, arrived with a vengeance. He conjured seductive visions, summoned terrifying armies, and whispered every doubt imaginable. But Siddhartha met each challenge with silence, his mind like still water reflecting the moon. Not once did he flinch. Finally, on the 49th day, as the morning star shimmered in the sky, the final veil lifted. Siddhartha's mind opened to a truth so profound, it dissolved all suffering. He saw the nature of reality, impermanence, interconnection, and the illusion of self. In that moment, he became the Buddha, the awakened one. No longer Siddhartha, no longer prince, no longer seeker. He was awake. He sat beneath that tree in quiet awe, not with pride, but with immense compassion. For what he had discovered wasn't just for him. It was for all beings trapped in the cycle of birth and death. He could have stayed in that bliss, slipped into the silence of nirvana. But the Buddha chose otherwise. He chose to return to the world, to teach, to guide, to share what he had seen. The fire of compassion burned brighter than ever, and his journey was far from over. The Buddha rose from beneath the Bodhi tree with a stillness that carried the weight of profound realization. The wind whispered through the leaves, as if the universe itself acknowledged the birth of awakened wisdom. He had gone to the edge of existence and returned with clarity, not as a king, not as a monk, but as a man who had peeled back the layers of illusion and seen the world as it truly was. And now, with the boundless compassion that had sprouted in his heart, he turned his gaze back to the world he had once left behind. He walked with calm steps, his feet barely disturbing the dust, and approached the people of the world once more. Not as someone superior, but as a friend with a lantern, offering light to those still stumbling through the dark. His first thought was to share this realization, to express the truth that had shattered suffering and unveiled peace. But then doubt crept in. Would anyone understand? Would the world, tangled in desires and distractions, have ears to hear something so simple and yet so utterly profound? For a moment he considered silence. Perhaps words could never capture the truth. But in the quiet recesses of his mind came a vision. Beings like lotus flowers, each at a different stage of blooming. Some submerged in muddy waters, some just beneath the surface, and some stretching upward, ready to blossom. And for those ready to open, he knew he had to speak. So the Buddha sought out his first audience, his former companions in asceticism. They had scorned him when he accepted food, turned their backs on him when he chose the middle path. And yet, the moment they saw him now, something was different. He radiated peace, Not the peace of comfort, but the unshakable kind that comes from seeing beyond all suffering. Despite their skepticism, they listened. What he shared that day would echo through the centuries. The Four Noble Truths. The realization that suffering exists, that it arises from craving and attachment, that it can end, and that there is a path, a noble path, that leads to that end. It wasn't a doctrine or a command. It was a mirror held up to life, a map drawn from his own footsteps. The path he described was not a divine decree, but a practical guide. 8 aspects to walk with: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This was not a list of rules, but a rhythm of living that brought harmony to the soul. The men who had once fasted beside him now sat with eyes wide, the first petals of understanding opening in their hearts. One by one, they too began to awaken. And from that moment, a community was born, not of followers, but of fellow seekers, the Sangha. Men and women, young and old, all drawn by the promise of a freedom that did not depend on gods or gold. The Buddha did not claim to save them. He simply pointed to the path and invited them to walk. For the next 45 years, the Buddha walked the dusty roads of India, his feet blistered, but his heart full. He spoke in forests, on mountain slopes, by rivers, and in the shadows of grand cities. He spoke to kings and beggars, warriors and outcasts, merchants and monks. His teachings flowed like water, clear, cool, and quenching the thirst of those who listened with open minds. He told stories, not grand myths, but tales rooted in the everyday. He used metaphors, questions, and moments of silence more powerful than 1,000 sermons. He taught that nothing was permanent, that everything that arises will also pass away. And far from this being a source of sorrow, he showed it was the gateway to peace. If nothing lasts forever, then clinging is futile. If pain is not eternal, then hope is always near. He taught that the self, the I we so desperately protect, is a construction, a swirl of thoughts, sensations, and experiences. It feels solid, but it's like a flame dancing in the wind, ever changing. The more we try to define it, the more it slips away. And in letting go of this illusion, a great space opens up. A space where compassion can live, where judgment dissolves, and where we see others not as rivals, but as reflections. The Buddha's presence was a balm to those around him. People would sit in his silence and feel their burdens ease. Children would stop crying in his arms. Animals would rest near his feet. Even those who came to argue would leave softened, not because he won debates, but because he never entered them with ego. He didn't preach conquest of the world. He offered liberation from the need to conquer. And yet his journey was not without hardship. He faced betrayal, ridicule, and even attempts on his life. There were those who feared his message, who clung to the old ways of power and superstition. But the Buddha met resistance not with anger, but with patience. He knew that hate was never quenched by hate, but only by love. Once a man came and insulted him, hurling words like stones. The Buddha stood still and asked the man a question. If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong? The man, puzzled, replied, to the one who offered it. Exactly, the Buddha said, smiling. Then I do not accept your anger, and it remains with you. These teachings did not stay in temples or monasteries. They seeped into the lives of those who heard them. A butcher laid down his knife. A prince abdicated his throne. A courtesan found peace not in wealth or admiration, but in mindfulness and self-worth. The ripples spread far and wide, touching hearts without boundaries of caste, gender, or status. The Buddha's own son, Rahula, eventually came to him, curious about the father who had walked away. And instead of lectures, the Buddha offered him presence, wisdom, and love. Rahula too became a monk, not out of duty, but from a quiet pull toward the same truth that had once uprooted his father's life. As the years rolled on, the Sangha grew. Monasteries emerged not as fortresses, but as havens where people could train the mind, explore their hearts, and sit in stillness without judgment. The Buddha never asked for worship, he asked for understanding. "Be a light unto yourselves," he would say. "Don't follow me blindly. Test everything in your own experience." And as he aged, the lines on his face deepened, but his eyes never dimmed. He walked with a limp, ate modest meals, and slept beneath trees. Yet the peace within him grew brighter, like a flame no wind could touch. People would gather for days just to hear a few words from his lips, to watch the way he folded his robe, to feel the silence that followed his footsteps. In one village, a mother came to him in tears, holding the lifeless body of her child. She begged him to bring the child back. The Buddha looked at her with gentle eyes and told her to fetch a mustard seed from a house that had never known death. She ran from door to door, desperate, only to discover that every family had tasted loss. And slowly, the truth settled in. She returned to the Buddha, not with the seed, but with understanding. And he held her as she wept, her heart beginning to heal. These were the miracles the Buddha performed, not walking on water or turning stones into gold, but turning pain into peace, confusion into clarity, and fear into freedom. He spoke often of the candle. "Thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle," he said, "and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared." His goal was not to be the only light, but to spark countless others. People began to call him the Tathagata, the one who is thus gone. Not just a title, but a reminder that he was a traveler, not a god, a bridge, not a destination. He didn't want statues, he wanted seekers. He didn't want temples, he wanted transformation. As his final days approached, he gathered his disciples beneath the trees, now old but still radiant with presence. They asked him what they should do once he was gone. He smiled gently and said, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence." It was not a farewell. It was a beginning. The Buddha's passing was not met with cries of despair or the wailing of grief-stricken crowds. Instead, there was a vast and profound stillness that fell upon those who had gathered beneath a canopy of trees. The air was heavy with reverence, not sorrow. For those who truly understood his teachings, death was not an end. It was simply another unfolding of the great, ever-changing dance of existence. The Buddha's body, frail and aged, may have been stilled, but his presence lingered, alive in the silence, in the breath of his disciples, in the wisdom that had taken root in their hearts. The Sangha sat together, the flickering firelight casting long shadows on the earth as they remembered his words. He had told them not to cling, not to worship his form or fossilize his teachings into lifeless dogma. He urged them to look within, to use his insights as a guide rather than a chain. And that night, as stars blinked into the sky one by one, a quiet determination settled over the community. They would continue the path, not in mourning, but in mindful living. The wheel of Dharma would keep turning, and turn it did. The teachings spread like wildflowers, carried by those who had walked beside the Buddha and those who had only glimpsed him from afar. They spoke not just of philosophy or ritual, but of transformation. They told stories, real, grounded stories of people who had been changed, softened, awakened. These teachings crossed rivers and mountains, finding their way into the hands and hearts of all kinds of people. And slowly, the seed that had sprouted under the Bodhi tree grew into a forest. In the centuries that followed, the wisdom that began with one man under a tree would evolve into different schools, different languages, different cultures. Yet at the core, the essence remained the same. Suffering exists, but so does a way out. It's not a promise of paradise or reward. It's an invitation to see clearly, to live fully, to meet each moment with awareness and compassion. And still, after all these years, the image of that prince turned monk continues to ripple through. But why does it still resonate? Why does his story, told and retold for over 2 millennia, still find its way into the modern heart, tangled in the noise of our digital world? Because it's not just his story, it's ours. Each one of us, in some quiet corner of our soul, is Siddhartha walking through the palace gates. We all carry the same aching questions, the same longing to understand why joy slips through our fingers, why peace seems just out of reach, why we chase and grasp and still feel empty. The world may look different now, but the human heart hasn't changed all that much. The drama of desire, the fear of loss, the weight of expectation, it plays out in every era, every culture, every life. And like Siddhartha, many of us reach a point where the comforts we once worshipped begin to feel hollow. The bright lights dim, the applause fades, and we're left staring at the quiet void behind it all. That's when the search begins. Not out there, but within. And that's where the Buddha's voice whispers, not in thunder, but in stillness. Be mindful. Be present. Let go. There's a kind of fierce tenderness in his message. He doesn't sugarcoat life. He doesn't pretend suffering can be avoided. Instead, he invites us to face it, to see it clearly, without resistance, and through that seeing, to find our freedom. Not a freedom that escapes pain, but one that is no longer ruled by it. This freedom isn't hidden in mountain caves or ancient texts. It's in the simple act of watching the breath, of noticing the thoughts that arise like clouds and pass away. It's in the space between reactivity and response, in the moment you choose to listen instead of shout, to forgive instead of cling. Every second becomes a chance to wake up. And waking up isn't about perfection. It's about honesty. It's about seeing the mind's tricks, the ego's disguises, and gently, without judgment, peeling them away. It's about recognizing that the very person who annoys us is also the one who teaches us patience, that our fears are not enemies, but messengers, that the present moment, no matter how ordinary, is sacred ground. One of the most beautiful truths the Buddha shared is that we all have this capacity. Enlightenment is not reserved for monks in robes or sages in silence. It lives in each of us, quietly waiting behind the noise. The potential to awaken is as natural as breathing. It only asks for attention, courage, and kindness. The story of the Buddha is not an escape from life. It is an invitation into it, a reminder that you don't have to run away to monasteries or shave your head to begin the journey. The path begins wherever you are, at your desk, in traffic, in heartbreak, in joy. Every experience is a doorway, and along the way, we're not alone. Communities have formed around these teachings, filled with people who stumble and rise, who support each other not with judgment, but with shared humanity. These are not perfect people. They are real people, people who cry, laugh, fall apart, and put themselves back together. Just like the early disciples, they gather not to worship, but to remember, to reflect, to breathe, to walk this path together. That's why Wisdom's Solace exists, not just to tell the Buddha's story, but to walk beside you as you write your own. Because the path to awakening isn't a solo journey. It's a shared unfolding, like petals blooming in rhythm. And just as the Buddha once chose to return and teach, countless people now choose to share what they've seen, in hopes it will ease another's pain or spark another's awakening. You don't have to wait for the stars to align or for life to be perfect. The Buddha didn't awaken in a palace. He awakened under a tree battered by storms both within and without. And so can you. Maybe not in a flash, maybe not today, But every breath, every moment of awareness brings you closer to that stillness, that clarity, that deep knowing. Imagine if even a few moments each day were filled with that kind of presence. What would it change? Would the arguments matter as much? Would the regrets sting as deeply? Would we hold others a little more gently, knowing they too are struggling beneath their surface? This isn't philosophy, it's a lived experience. The Buddha didn't just teach, he embodied. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed the world around him. He laughed with children, comforted the grieving, and sat quietly with the dying. He lived his truth not on a pedestal, but on the ground, where the rest of us walk. And that's why his legacy endures. Because it's not about bowing to statues or reciting chants. It's about learning to bow to life itself, to each moment, each person, each breath, with reverence. It's about creating a life that's aligned with what truly matters. And what truly matters is simple: kindness, presence, clarity, peace. These are not lofty ideals. They are practical tools as real as the shoes on your feet. You can practice them while washing dishes.
And once you realize that, you start moving differently through the world. You stop taking things as personally. Someone cuts you off in traffic, and you notice the reaction arise. Tight chest, clenched jaw, the impulse to respond. But then, rather than indulging it, you just watch. And in the watching, something magical happens. It passes. Not because you forced it away, but because you didn't grab hold of it. You didn't make it yours. You didn't feed it with more story. And in that small moment of letting go, a door opens. A door into a completely different way of living. One that's not reactive, but responsive. One that doesn't need to fix the world in order to be at peace. And the beauty is, you don't need to go on a pilgrimage or live in a cave to find this. You can find it in your kitchen, washing a plate. You can find it in the sound of your child breathing as they sleep. You can find it in the ache of your back after a long day. Because presence doesn't require silence or perfect conditions. It only requires attention. It only asks you to show up fully for what is already here. And when you do, life begins to reveal its own rhythm. You stop living in resistance. You stop arguing with reality. And instead, you begin to cooperate with what's true. It's not that pain disappears. It's that your relationship to pain becomes intimate, even compassionate. You stop running. You stop negotiating. You stop needing the pain to go away before you can feel whole. And in that moment, when you lean into what hurts without needing it to change, you taste a kind of freedom that no external success can ever offer. A freedom born not of escape, but of intimacy. A freedom that lives not in avoiding discomfort, but in being unshakably present with it. And when you start living from that space, you begin to notice something remarkable. The pain changes. Not because you forced it, but because you finally let it speak. We are conditioned to mute our inner world, to stay busy, to stay productive, to stay numb. But your emotions aren't enemies. They are messengers. Every wave of sadness, every flicker of anger, every pulse of joy, it all has something to show you. Something to teach you about where you've been holding on, about what you've been avoiding, about the places inside you that still believe you're not enough. But you don't get those lessons by analyzing them from a distance. You get them by feeling, by surrendering your control, your expectations, your ideas about how life should unfold. You get them by being nakedly present, moment by moment, breath by breath, without turning away. And when you stop turning away, life becomes incredibly real. Not always easy, not always pretty, but undeniably real. You start to see the sacredness in the most unexpected places, in the cracks of a wall, in the trembling hands of an old man, in the way the wind carries a leaf across the sidewalk. The world stops being something you pass through blindly. It becomes something you participate in with reverence, with care, with the kind of attention that changes everything, even if nothing has changed. People start to notice too. not because you're doing anything flashy, but because your presence carries a different weight. You're no longer caught up in needing to prove anything. You're not rushing to be understood. You're not afraid of being misunderstood. You're just here, fully. And that kind of presence is magnetic. It doesn't demand attention. It creates space. It doesn't seek to be loved. It allows others to feel safe enough to be themselves. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real. Real in a way that feels like a deep breath in a world of shallow distractions. And slowly, your relationships shift. You stop needing to be right all the time. You stop needing others to change for you to be okay. You start loving from a place that doesn't grasp, doesn't cling, doesn't trap. It's not romantic love or conditional love or the love that comes with a list of rules. It's spacious, it's fierce in its honesty, but soft in its delivery. It knows how to walk away without closing the heart. It knows how to stay without losing itself. It knows how to listen, not just to words, but to silence, to energy, to what's really being said beneath the surface. That kind of love isn't found in a fairy tale. It's forged in presence, in the fire of awareness, in the willingness to feel deeply without being consumed. And it starts with you, with the way you meet yourself, the way you speak to yourself when no one is listening, the way you hold your own pain, not as a problem to fix, but as a part of you longing to be seen. When you stop abandoning yourself, when you start turning toward your own wounds with care, with curiosity, with patience, you begin to heal in ways that ripple outward, even when you're not trying. Healing, it turns out, isn't something you do. It's something that happens when you stop interfering. You begin to see the intelligence in your challenges, the grace in your setbacks. You see how every loss carved out space for something deeper, how every breakdown was secretly a breakthrough in disguise. Not because the pain didn't matter, but because it mattered so much that it had to break you open. And that kind of opening can't be faked. It can't be fast-tracked. It comes from walking through the fire and choosing, again and again, not to close, not to shut down, not to harden your heart just because it hurts, but to stay, to feel, to breathe through it. And in doing so, you become a different kind of person. Not better, not superior, but more real, more available, more here. And people feel that, even if they don't have words for it. They feel it in your eyes, in your calm, in the way you don't flinch when they show their pain, in the way you don't rush to fix it. You're not performing empathy. You're not offering advice. You're offering presence. And that is rare, that is powerful, because in a world where everyone's trying to be seen, the real gift is the ability to see someone in their wholeness, not their wounds, to see them beyond their story, beyond their identity, to see the light behind the fog, and to remind them gently that it never went out. That kind of presence doesn't come from reading books or memorizing teachings. It comes from embodiment, from living the truth, from walking the path not once, but every single day, in small moments that no one else sees. When you wake up in the middle of the night with anxiety and choose not to distract, but to breathe. When you feel the urge to lash out, and instead, you pause and feel the heat behind the anger. When you're overwhelmed by grief, but instead of collapsing, you let the wave pass through you without drowning in it. These are the moments that build a different kind of strength. Not the strength to win, but the strength to stay open, to love anyway, to soften when it would be easier to harden. And that strength creates a kind of clarity, a way of seeing the world that cuts through illusion. You start to see where people are operating from fear, from lack, from unhealed wounds, and you don't judge them for it. You understand, because you've been there too. And that understanding makes you less reactive. You stop taking things so personally. Someone lashes out, and instead of retaliating, you see the pain behind their words. Someone pulls away, and instead of chasing, you give them space. Someone disappoints you, and instead of closing, you grieve the loss and remain open to love anyway. Not because it's easy, because it's true. And the more you live from that truth, the more life begins to meet you there. You find that you're drawn to different people. You care about different things. You no longer crave the noise, the drama, the chaos. You crave depth, silence, authenticity, not to escape the world, but to enter it fully, without pretense, without performance. You start to notice beauty again. Not the kind you chase, but the kind that's always been there, waiting to be seen. The way sunlight hits a wall, the sound of the wind moving through trees, the way someone's voice trembles when they speak their truth. These small moments become sacred, not because they're rare, but because you're finally here to notice them. And that's the real miracle of awakening. Not that everything changes, but that you change the way you see. You change the way you listen. You change the way you show up. And the world reflects that, not as a reward, but as a response. Because life, in its deepest essence, is responsive to presence. And when you offer those things freely, not to get anything, not to prove anything, but simply because they're what's real, you become a kind of tuning fork for truth. You start vibrating in resonance with the deeper rhythms of the universe. You stop resisting the tide. You become the ocean. There's something quietly powerful about realizing that you don't need to chase anything anymore. Not success, not peace, not even healing. Because what begins to unfold in the heart of awakening is not a life of avoidance, not a state where nothing can touch you, but a shift in how you relate to everything. A shift so simple, so quietly transformative, that it often goes unnoticed at first. You start to see clearly that the striving itself, this constant aching forward motion, was never taking you anywhere. The self you were trying to improve, fix, purify, evolve, it was never you to begin with. And once that clicks, something deep inside exhales. You don't suddenly become enlightened. You don't float away, but you do become still. Not still like a frozen statue, but like a deep river that flows without noise, without urgency, with an ease that cannot be faked. This kind of stillness isn't about never being disturbed. It's about no longer being defined by the disturbance.